with DJ Wishart and
DJ Mo the Bro.
And today we have our special guest.
We have Professor Pauli from Kettering University. Professor Pauli is a social scientist. He got his PhD in social science from Rutgers University. And today we'll be talking about the political aspects of Flint Water Crisis. And Dr. Pauli has been interested in this topic since January of 2016, and he's lived in Flint most of his life.
Well, since June of 2015.
June,
so almost,
okay.
Yeah, I'm not that old, so
I thought you were born here.
That's a good chunk of my life.
Yep. So, Dr. Pauli, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in it and what helps you keep learning more about the topic.
Sure. So maybe I should begin with what brought me to Flint in the first place, because there is a personal aspect to the answer. So I was hired by Kettering in summer of 2015, so I moved here with my family in June, including my 3-year-old son. And at that time, we were told that there had been some issues with the water quality in the city, but that the city more or less had gotten those under control. It was in the process of installing some new filters in the water treatment plant. And we were told to expect some fluctuations in the taste of the water, but we didn't think that there was anything serious.
And this was in 2015?
This is in the summer of 2015, so it's worth saying that this is before the lead story broke. So the concerns up to that point that the community had expressed around the water related to things like bacterial contamination. Going back to 2014, there were some boil water advisories, 3 of them in fact, that suggested that bacteria may be present in this. In fact, total coliform bacteria was found, and that suggests the possibility of E. coli contamination. So there was concern around bacteria. And in January of 2015, the city let residents know for the first time that it was in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act because of the presence of chlorine byproducts called total trihalomethane, or TTHM.
Right.
But the filters that were being installed at the water treatment plant in the summer of 2015 were supposed to help solve the problem of chlorine byproducts by filtering out the organic matter that reacts with the chlorine and produces them. And so, again, it was our understanding that the city was more or less getting things under control, and that there was nothing serious to be worried about. So we always used a Brita pitcher for drinking, and but we did cook with unfiltered tap water. We later learned that that Brita pitcher was not doing an adequate job of filtering out lead. And so when we started to learn about the systemic lead contamination, we did have our water tested, and we found that we did indeed have some lead and some copper in our water. And with a 3-year-old child, lead and copper, yes, that was a source of concern. There was a bit of a mystery as to where the lead was coming from, because it's clear that the service line, which is the part of your pipes that connects your interior plumbing to the water main that runs down the middle of the street, it was clear that the line coming into our house was made of copper. Right. So it's understandable that there would be some copper in the water, but where the lead was coming from was a little bit of a mystery. And one of the theories is that people with copper lines who have lead in their water probably have some sort of lead solder somewhere along the way. So it used to be the case that when pipes would break, they would repair the pipes with solder that had lead in it. And that's no longer used, but a lot of the homes around here are older homes. And looking at our interior plumbing, we could tell there had been some breaks over the years, so that may have been where our lead was coming from. So we wanted to get that problem taken care of straight away, as you can imagine.
And this is, what year is this again?
So we're still talking about 2015, so this would be the late summer, early fall of 2015.
Yeah, so I guess like the reason I keep bringing about time is because time is really important in this, because this is about like really figuring out what went wrong so it doesn't happen in the future, just acknowledging that fact. And we have to know like when was this happening. So Summer and fall of 2015.
Well, the timeline gets a little bit tricky because, especially once you get to the fall of 2015, because things start to happen quickly. So
I see.
It was in September that people became aware of a systemic problem with lead, and it was clear that the city was over the EPA's action level for lead, and that immediate steps needed to be taken to get the lead out of the water.
And who determined that?
Well, so, there were residents going all the way back to early 2015 who were concerned about lead in the water. So there were particular cases where residents were sending in tests and getting some very concerning results back. But the problem at that point was demonstrating that those were not isolated issues, and that, in fact, the problem of lead contamination was affecting the whole system. And so it took months to convince the authorities that that was true. It took a major water sampling effort that involved a collaboration between residents and a team led by Mark Edwards of Virginia Tech.
Right.
So they did their sampling through September of 2015.
Okay.
And
this is before EPA stepped in.
Well, at that point, the residents had petitioned the EPA to get involved because they were convinced that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was not going to be up to the task of confronting this issue.
I see.
So they did appeal to the EPA, but the EPA was kind of MIA. They were saying internally, anyway, that Flint was maybe not a community worth going out on a limb for, and so they were dragging their feet. And so residents needed another way of bringing attention to the problems that they knew at that point existed. So the collaboration with Virginia Tech, which actually came out with a blood lead levels study where she looked at the change in the levels of lead in children's blood in the city during the time when Flint was on the river. And she was able to show a correlation between areas of the city where there were high levels of lead and high levels of blood lead in children. And so if there was a smoking gun in the Flint Water Crisis, that's what it was. That's sort of what broke the story open. That's what got people paying serious attention.
Coming up with those blood results.
That was absolutely critical. Right, so...
Did you pay heavily attention to that? Was that...
Yeah, absolutely, because at that point, again, we were very directly affected on a personal level. We had a 3-year-old child who had been exposed to the water for a couple of months without any filtration. And so, like many other parents in the city at that point, first we took steps to make sure that the water that we were using to drink and cook with was safe. So that meant installing a filter on our kitchen faucet. And that in and of itself was a huge ordeal because we couldn't get one to fit. We had to have a home that was built in 1950. I think the sink was probably original. And this was an issue that a lot of people faced, is that they had difficulty installing these filters to begin with. We ended up having to replace the whole faucet in order to make it possible to get a filter on there. And so that actually went on for weeks. And then finally, eventually, we got around to testing my son's blood.
Oh, wow.
And again, we were neurotoxin, and that its most serious effect is that it can lead to cognitive impairments as children develop. So there were a lot of fears around that, and I would put us in that category, even though we hadn't been exposed for as long. You never know when a piece of particulate lead is going to flake off and end up in whatever you're cooking or whatever you're drinking. And just one flake can be enough to send a child's blood lead levels skyrocketing.
Definitely.
The problem in our case, and this was true of a lot of others as well, is that by the time we got my son's blood lead tested, we'd already been drinking filtered water for over a month, and lead only stays in the blood for about a month's time. So if you're doing your test after, a month or so after the exposure, then it really doesn't tell you anything about whether or not your child was exposed. They do have some other ways of testing for exposure. So when children's teeth fall out, they can test the teeth to see what the exposure was like over time. It's almost like tree rings. You can go back and you can look to see how much lead was present at a particular time. So, we may end up doing that in the future with my son just to be sure.
Right.
Do you think you'd ever have to, did you explain it to the child at all, or?
I am pretty certain that in his case, there's not going to be any lasting problem.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want him growing up thinking that he has been damaged or that, he's going to be any less capable than other children because of this.
Definitely.
Which isn't to say that there aren't any lingering effects. I mean, he's learned that you don't put unfiltered water in your mouth, so even if he's in the bathtub splashing around and some water, happens to get into his mouth, he kind of freaks out. And I think that's a really unfortunate psychological consequence of all of this.
Definitely. So, one thing people really wanted to know about last week was, is this a race problem? Is it not? And I feel like as a social scientist, political scientist, you would have a view on this. What do you think?
Well, what I like to do is I like to start with the perspective of residents on this question, and I obviously am a resident, so, but in many ways I'm not a typical resident of Flint. And just having given you a little bit of my personal background, it's clear that people like me, a white person, were impacted by this. And one of the points that has been made by some of the water activists who have been involved in the struggle for clean water here is that lead does not discriminate in the sense that whatever your skin color is, you can be affected by it in serious ways. And because the lead was distributed more or less evenly throughout the system, although some areas of the city did have higher levels than others, then everybody, black or white, was at least potentially exposed and potentially harmed by the lead.
I see.
On the other hand, when you're looking at the question of race, you got to go back to some of the background factors that arguably led up to the crisis. I mean, there's been a lot of racism historically in this city that has shaped the geography of the city, that has shaped the economics of the city, that has shaped the politics of the city. Arguably, it's one of the factors that contributed to the fact that the city was facing a financial crisis that led to the imposition of emergency managers here who made some of the crucial decisions leading up to the water crisis.
Yes.
And so the Michigan Civil Rights Commission just released a report in which they found that structural racism, so going far back in Flint's history, was absolutely one of the underlying causes of the crisis, if you want to talk about it in that historical
Structural racism, okay.
I remember, I cited you for Intro to Social Science, and I remember you talked about a book that I never got around to reading, but it was something going back to Flint.
Yeah, so the Michigan Civil Rights Commission relied heavily upon the research of a historian by the name of Andrew Highsmith, who wrote a book called Demolition Means Progress, which is really the most comprehensive history of Flint that we have. And he goes all the way back to the early 20th century, and he talks a little bit about the history of industry in Flint, the history of housing, the history of education, and he's certainly very sensitive to, among other things, the racial dynamics that influence all of those aspects of Flint's history. And so it really is a treasure trove of information, and it's an essential resource if we're to understand how Flint got to be to where it is today.
For sure.
I see. So, I guess, one question I was thinking of is, so you said, Flint residents, few months went by before Flint residents could convince the authorities to, kind of step in.
Well, it was very many months, depending on how far you want to go back. I mean, of course, residents were wary about the switch to the Flint River even before it happened. Right. So, switch was made in April 2014. almost immediately people started seeing changes in the quality of the water and started experiencing health symptoms like rashes and hair loss.
And I guess like one important thing that a lot of people always talk about is that the government falsified data. They manipulated data to prove that there was no problem. And is that true or is that not true?
Well, you could say there were a couple of different notable instances of that. So once people started to, I mean, the city is required to test for lead every so often by the federal lead and copper rule. And so in 2015, just as people were starting to raise some initial concerns about lead, the city was going through its usual testing. And during that process, there were a couple of key data points that ended up being thrown out for various reasons that had the effect of making it look like the city was below the EPA's action level when in fact it was not. There were some other concerns about the way the city went about doing its testing. It's supposed to test those homes which are thought to be at special risk of lead contamination. It's supposed to seek those out. And it's pretty clear that it did not do that. And so that's one of the reasons why criminal charges have been brought against Mike Glasgow, who used to work at the water treatment plant, and some folks at the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality who were advising him during that sampling process. So that would be one instance of what seems to be a pretty straightforward falsification of data. There's another important example, though, that cropped up later on when people started talking about blood lead. There was an analysis done by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which again made it look like there had not been a notable increase in blood lead levels in Flint children during the time when Flint was on the river. And in her analysis and in a subsequent CDC study that backed it up, Dr. Hannah Atisha was able to show that was wrong.
So, let's calm down for a second, right? So,
wait, who's worked up here?
So, the Department of Human Services, they say that it was fine, or it was...
Well, what they said was that any increase in the blood lead levels that was appearing in Dr. Hannah Atisha's data was explainable in terms of seasonal variation. Blood lead levels always go up in the summer because you've got kids playing outside in the soil and there's lots of lead in the soil. Thanks to Charles Kettering, we should say, who was the first to put lead in gasoline, ended up in the environment for that reason. And so when kids, something to be proud of here. So as kids play in the soil, their exposure to lead increases, their blood lead levels go up. It happens every summer. And so one of the things they were saying at the DHHS was that some of what Dr. Hannah Atisha's data was showing was perhaps explainable in terms of that seasonal variability.
Okay, so they were relying on seasonal variability to explain that.
Speaking of seasonal variability, just a little segue into the forecast for this temperature.
You're welcome.
It's 54 degrees Fahrenheit in Flint, Michigan, with a humidity of 87%. So look forward to hearing a further report further down the line on the weekly report.
Cool. So seasonal variability was what? So Dr. Atisha shows the results, and she's like, in our pediatric floor, there are patients with high lead levels. The Michigan Department of DHHS, Health and Human Services, they were like, no, this is seasonal variability. And then, where does CDC get involved?
Well, I mean, the CDC has been involved in multiple ways, but later in 2016, they did their own study of blood lead data during the same period of time, and they effectively corroborated the study that was done by Dr. Hannah Atisha.
Interesting. So then what did Michigan, did they feel dumb or what?
Well, not at first, at least not officially. So when Virginia Tech came out with their lead results, they were accused of pulling rabbits out of hats. They were accused of having some sort of ulterior, possibly political
That's Dr.
motive.
Edwards.
That's Dr. Edwards. And the very same thing happened to Dr. Hannah Atisha. When she came out with her blood lead results, she was called an unfortunate researcher, whatever that means. And again, her data was brought into question. But in that case, it didn't take long for the DHHS to kind of reassess its data and realize that it was wrong, and she was right. And so it was a matter of a couple of weeks until they admitted.
So I guess let's really try to dive into that, I guess, because so what time period are we talking about right now?
So we're still talking about the late summer, early fall of 2015 now.
Summer. So April 2014 was when we made the switch.
Right.
And then now we're talking summer and fall of 2015.
Yeah, so going on a year and a half after the switch.
So when GM was here and they started noticing the metal corrosion and all that, and they switched back to Flint Township water.
Yes. That was back in 2014.
That was awesome.
That was back.
So we were aware that something's happening, but
Yeah. Well, and of course they had their own way of explaining what about the water might be affecting their engine parts in that way. One of the things that they do there is they recycle the water a number of times, and so there was some thinking that it was that process that may be making the water more corrosive in that particular case. But it was pretty clear that the river water was more corrosive to begin with. And I think when a lot of residents learned about that, they started imagining what the water was doing to their bodies.
Exactly.
If it can,
I think that.
If it can corrode engine parts, it must be able to corrode me.
Yeah.
But and retrospectively, you'd think that at that time, people, and I'm not just talking about residents, but we're talking about the authorities who have responsibility for public health here.
Right.
We'd think they would have started raising questions about the corrosion of the pipes, the corrosion of the infrastructure. But those issues really did not arise until later.
Okay, so when you talk about authorities, what agencies are we talking about?
Well, I mean, so we're talking about people at the city level, like the Director of Public Works. We're talking about people at the water treatment plant, whose job it is to ensure that the water leaving the treatment plant is of a high quality. We're talking about people at the state, particularly the MDEQ, which was working closely with people at the water treatment plant at that time on their treatment plan, in fact, advising them every step of the way. And that's one of the reasons why they've been called sort of the principal culprits in all of this, from the technical point of view, anyway. You also have, to some extent, the DHHS, which is supposed to monitor certain aspects of public health and pay attention to instances in which there's a noticeable change in public health. So in terms of the immediate oversight of sort of the day-to-day operation of the water system, and those are the people we're talking about. For the most part...
And you did not mention EPA.
I didn't mention EPA because the EPA doesn't have any reason usually to get involved in the day-to-day
That is
operation
so fascinating.
of the water system. In fact, because of the restrictions that we've put on the EPA, it's pretty leery of intervening and sort of taking the reins from state-level departments of environmental quality like the MDEQ, because it doesn't want to be accused of interfering with the states.
This is fascinating because you Google Flint Water Crisis government, anything of that sort, EPA pops out almost every article. And you're saying it shouldn't, it wasn't even their job, I guess?
Well, not in terms of the day-to-day. I mean, the EPA sets the federal guidelines around things like, the presence of lead and copper in the water. And so, the state agencies like the MDEQ are operating within that framework. So, in that sense, the EPA creates the context in which these agencies go about their business. But in terms of the immediate oversight of the water system, that's not the EPA's job.
Interesting.
So we talked about what happened in 2015, 14, 16. What's happening now in 2017? How do you know, how are you most active now?
Well, so much has gone on since where we just left off the story to today, because, we only got up to, October or so of 2015, which is the month when Flint was switched back onto Detroit water, so-called, meaning it's getting Lake Huron water.
When was that again?
This is October of 2015 that happened. So,
Oh, wow, I guess there was a lot of noise.
so
October 14, okay.
right. So, but at that point, the crisis was, of course, far from over because the water had so damaged the infrastructure that there were still lots of problems with lead floating around. There were concerns about bacterial contamination because, particularly with certain kinds of pipes, holes were being found that would allow contaminants to enter the system that way.
So that is, like, chemical engineering-wise, looking at that aspect, it's like, so pipes were good, and then we put the river water through them.
Well, I don't know if I'd say the pipes were good. I mean, Flint had an old, aging infrastructure to begin with, so many of these pipes were already overdue for replacement.
Yeah, I remember Sullivan mentioned that,
Right.
that they did try, and there was like a rule, they did replace a certain amount every so many months, years, days, and they didn't, because it's hard to prove that.
Right. So, I mean, the lead and copper rule actually requires any city with lead service lines to progressively replace them year by year, but that doesn't tend to happen, especially in places like Flint, which are cash-strapped to begin with.
Definitely. So, so I guess, like, let's call it, because before the switch, I did not hear much about the lead poisoning, I guess. So the pipes were in mediocre condition. That was
If you could put it that way.
And then we put the river water through them, and then things got worse. And then 1 year and 6 months later, in October of 2015, we switched back to the clean water.
Right, but the problem at that point was because the infrastructure was degraded, the water coming in could be as clean as you like, but it's still got to travel through those pipes.
Exactly. So the damage was already done.
So it's going to pick up all kinds of stuff that's continuing to leach off of the pipes as well as just floating around in the system. If there are contaminants entering through holes in the pipes, then that's going to be an issue as well. It creates problems with the chlorination because you want to make sure that chlorine gets to the extremities of the system. And if there's stuff floating around in the water, it eats up the chlorine. And so you end up with parts of the city where there's hardly any chlorine to speak of. And of course, that only increases the problem of bacterial contamination.
Were you concerned at all about chlorine levels? Or?
No, at my house, I've had my chlorine tested now a few times, and it's always very high. So, for whatever reason, I'm in a part of the city that has plenty of chlorine. Dr. Sullivan is in the opposite situation. She try as she might, she can't get up to the recommended level of chlorine there, no matter how much she flushes her water.
Yes.
So, that's an issue. But, so, just in terms of, like, carrying forward the narrative here, it was in January of 2016 that I sort of decided to plunge in and get officially involved. And so, I started going to meetings at the grassroots level that were being held by a variety of grassroots organizations, getting to know people that way. In April, I joined up with this multi-university scientific team, the Flint Area Community Health and Environment Partnership, which Dr. Sullivan is also part of. And we started working on putting together a major new study of the water quality in Flint, looking at Legionella bacteria in particular. And so we were working on that through the summer and the fall of 2016. And, in the meantime, I've been doing some of my own research, just trying to understand more about how the movement around the water got started and what role residents themselves played in the struggle for clean water in the city.
Because I think that's really interesting, too, to see that clearly most of the things that were getting resolved by this were because of someone speaking up, whether it's a resident or someone who's...
Absolutely, yeah, you have example after example of somebody in some sort of an official institutional position.
There are cities that have already encountered this, and is there a solution there already?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's potentially, more than one solution, but one important component of the solution has to be the replacement of the infrastructure. So, yes, there have been other water crises in American history, but the closest parallel to what happened in Flint was the Washington, D.C. lead and water crisis of the early 2000s.
Okay.
In that case, a switch in the way that they were disinfecting the water ended up leading to a lot of corrosion, and they too had lead pipes in their system, and so there ended up being a lot of lead that reached into the water supply and again got into the bloodstreams of the cities.
The president.
Yeah, and actually even the president at that time, George W. Bush, he was asked a couple of times by reporters whether or not he was drinking the water in the White House.
Interesting.
So this was a national story. There were a lot of people saying.
So how long did that last? Like how long was before that issue was solved?
It lasted a lot longer than what we've experienced here in Flint because it took so much time to convince people that there was an issue to begin with. And Mark Edwards, who's played such a central role here in Flint, also played a central role in that water crisis. He was really the main person who was trying to convince people that a serious issue with lead existed.
So I guess like one that kind of relates well to my next question, which is so when we talk about race and issues regarding that, I think of one race being more important than the other. Like in terms of Flint residents are not as important, let's say, but like here we're talking D.C. The president lives there.
Sure.
So I guess like in that regard, it's an equal playing field. It feels like even in D.C. this happened, and they.
Yeah, it's a good point, and actually it's one of the points that Mark Edwards himself has made about whether or not Flint might have been picked on because it was minority majority, because it was lower income. It's a complicated question, but and it really does require us to go take a step back and look at that broader political context, because there are many people who believe on the ground here that none of this would have happened if it weren't for the imposition of emergency management on Flint.
Yeah.
And if you look at the way that the emergency manager tends to get imposed on cities throughout the state, we're talking about predominantly poor, predominantly African American cities. And you could argue that the reason for that is more historical and structural than it is any manifestation of conscious, explicit bias. But if only on those levels, you could say that race is very much a factor in this.
Interesting.
So you brought up the question if this was like an engineering problem.
Right.
Now I'm interested to think more about like what's the social problem going on. I mean, clearly there's people who aren't accepting that they're wrong, but.
Yeah. So I mean, there is a technical side to the solution to the water crisis. We've got to make sure that we get our water treatment right. We've got to make sure that we've got a safe source of water to begin with. We got to make sure that our infrastructure is in such a condition that water can leave the water treatment plant in good shape and end up at your tap in good shape. So there are technical aspects to all of those kinds of issues, but of course there are also social and political issues as well. Like even the matter of water treatment, even the matter of infrastructure, because a lot of this depends on political will. So, for example, when it comes to the replacement of the pipes, I mean, it really depends on how much we as a country are willing to invest in our infrastructure, and not just in water, but in roads, and in all kinds of other things, and in bridges and so forth. What do we as a country take seriously in terms of where we're willing to devote our resources? So that's not just a technical question. There's a social and political backdrop as well. But there are also some reforms that some of the people involved in this struggle have been pushing that go beyond the matter of pipes and water treatment and so forth. They would like to see, for example, water recognized as a human right. They would like to see that codified in the laws of the state of Michigan. They would like to see that codified at the federal level. It already exists to some extent at the international level. but the United States does not recognize a human right to water. The state of Michigan does not recognize a human right to water. So there's a water as a human right bill package, which is languishing right now in committee at the state level.
State level?
We'll see what happens with that. But there are also efforts to learn from Flint about the way that we conduct our water monitoring and testing in this country. So there are efforts to change the federal guidelines around water quality. And Governor Snyder, it should be said, has been one of the advocates of lowering the action level for lead. So right now it's 15 parts per billion. That's the level set by the EPA. And he'd like to take it down, along with a lot of other people, would like to take it down to 10 parts per billion. Some people say we should go even lower. But one last thing I want to say about the solution to this is that because a lot of the people here in Flint believe that the emergency manager law played such a large role in the crisis, to them, part of the solution to the crisis is to abolish that law. So that's part of the struggle. This has been a struggle for clean water, but it has also been a pro-democracy struggle aimed at the emergency manager law in particular and the way in which it was applied here in Flint.
I see.
So when the emergency manager came in, I'm not too familiar. So was it because there was a crisis with money, and then they bring someone?
What brings an emergency manager? Because it has happened in Detroit, Saginaw, Flint.
Well, the short answer is that emergency managers are appointed by the state of Michigan when it decides that a financial emergency exists in a city which is unable to extricate itself from that financial emergency. And it's the state that basically gets to decide that. And so there's been some form of emergency manager law going all the way back to 1988 when Public Act 101 was passed in the state of Michigan. And that law has evolved over the years. It has become more expansive. It has accorded greater powers to state-appointed emergency managers to do whatever they think is necessary in order to whip these cities back into fiscal shape. And so back in 2002, from 2002 to 2004, Flint actually had what was at that time called an emergency financial manager under Public Act 72, which was the version of the emergency manager law that was in place at that time. And that was because the city had fallen on hard times. Financially, the state was not confident that people at the local level had the ability or the will to do what it thought was necessary in order to get out of that situation. But emergency financial managers were at least somewhat limited in their powers because they were there really to focus on very directly on the finances of the city.
I would like to think that way, yeah.
Yeah, it's right there in the name. But when the Snyder administration came to power, one of their pet ideas was to implement a stronger version of the emergency manager law in the form of Public Act 4. And so emergency financial managers became emergency managers. So and the dropping of that adjective was a reflection of the fact that the powers of emergency managers dramatically expanded.
So they dropped the financial part.
Right. So emergency managers under Public Act 4 had the power to do all kinds of things that they deemed to be necessary. They could sell off public assets. That was done here in Flint with Genesee Towers. It was done with Atwood Stadium, sold to Kettering by an emergency manager. This is one of the things that emergency managers can do in order to, actually even the Santa that used to sit on top of City Hall at Christmas time was auctioned off.
Santa Claus was auctioned?
Even poor Santa Claus had it coming. So,
that's so bizarre, because growing up, I remember, the one thing I remember is when Detroit got the emergency manager, and I was like, being the young as I was and I didn't understand, I was like, this is good then. So I don't, it's so weird to think that, emergency manager would not be good.
Well, the Detroit situation was different because the emergency manager, Kevin Orr, that was appointed in Detroit pretty quickly took the city into bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is different from emergency management because you're at the mercy of a bankruptcy judge who can do certain things that even emergency managers can't do. One of the things they can do, for example, is go after people's pensions. So that's one of the things that was done in Detroit is all of these public employees that had put in their time over the years and were in many cases dependent upon these pension checks had those cut back dramatically during this process of bankruptcy. So that's one of the things that emergency managers actually are not legally empowered to do. But they can sell off assets. They can do things like restructure the kind of health care that retirees get. So that's one of the battles that was fought in Flint. They can basically throw contracts that have been negotiated with labor unions out the window. So they can break contracts. That was one of the major new powers introduced by Public Act 4.
So Governor Snyder, a man who was talked about a lot in this whole crisis, as the politician. I guess before we talk about Governor Snyder, these two shows you want to talk about weather?
Of course we do. So,
who knows what has changed out there?
This weather
There'd be a
is
tornado raging outside the studio.
thankfully there is not.
There is
So
not.
it's currently 54 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's pretty hot in the studio right
It
now.
is a little toasty. It's been
I think the
outside.
temperature is in here.
It's probably 65 or something.
I'm feeling like maybe 80, but that's just me. But looking forward into the future, we're looking at highs of 40s, 33 on Fridays. So look forward to hopefully a snow this week, maybe, hopefully, crossing your fingers.
Oh, okay. You all snow?
That's the weather.
Yes.
You're listening to WKUF LP Flint 94.3 FM for those of you who just tuned in.
Sounds good. All right, back to our, discussion. Gordon Snyder, what was his role, I guess? Because it's so subjective. Based on your political ideology, people tend to favor one or the other. And I wonder, what is the actual answer or how to, best get to that answer? What was his contribution to all of this?
I mean, naturally there's going to be disagreement over that question. And part of the problem is that it's hard to tell what exactly his contribution is because we don't have a lot of access to Snyder and his inner circle and the kinds of conversations that they were having throughout all of this. I mean, we know that members of Governor Snyder's staff were raising issues to him, pretty early on about things that were going on with water in Flint. But, of course, it took a while for people at that level to be convinced that there was a systemic problem. And so, there was definitely a sense that people in Flint were unhappy, that, residents thought that there was an issue. But, I don't think anybody was going to Governor Snyder and raising serious red flags. Or if they did, we don't have the smoking gun evidence of that. So, there are certainly a lot of people who believe that he knew more than he has let on.
I guess, opinions aside, was CDC's data, Dr. Tisha's pediatrics data, was that, how was that looked at from state government side?
Well, again, I described the Department of Health and Human Services reaction. That was the agency at the state level that, was, that you would have expected to.
Yeah, sure. I guess, a lot of people don't understand the infrastructure. The governor, or his administration, they have agencies that work under them. And
Sure.
Those agencies would come across this information before he does, I guess.
You would think so, yeah. And in theory, the governor is getting reports from representatives of all these different agencies. So, he should be tuned in to a general way about what's going on. But again, because a lot of those conversations are internal, because there are a lot of issues in the state of Michigan with the transparency of communications at that level. So much information that we have has had to be FOIA'd. So we've gotten it through Freedom of Information Act requests. And actually, when it comes to the governor's personal communications, he's not even obligated to abide by those requests. So he did release a lot of his emails, but he did that voluntarily. There's nothing in the state law that allows him to do so.
Interesting.
So, and that's one of the implications of that is that, we're trusting him that he's giving us what we would need to know in order to assess the extent of his knowledge and the extent of his involvement.
According to the latest data, or what is our water condition at this moment? So March 6, 2017. We started off from April of 2014, so we're talking almost 3 years. What is our condition today?
Well, there is debate around that particular question, and a lot of that debate has to do with whether or not the crisis is framed as a lead and water crisis, or whether or not other problems with water quality are acknowledged. So the state has effectively framed the crisis as a lead and water crisis.
Okay.
Because it does not believe that there is enough evidence that there are contaminants in the water that are at levels that would be of concern from the standpoint of public health beyond that. And so the latest data that we have around lead testing does show that system-wide levels are going down, and in fact we are, if you believe the data, we're below the EPA's action level for lead.
Where is this data coming from? Because I guess the sources become very relevant.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting data from a variety of sources. So, Virginia Tech has done several rounds of testing in the city. The DEQ has sentinel sites that it has continued to monitor throughout the city. And I believe, so their data is coming most directly from their sentinel sites.
What do you mean about sentinel?
Sentinel site it's just a house that whose residents have volunteered to participate in the sentinel site sampling effort, and so they get their water sampled again and again and again, whereas others might get it sampled once or twice depending on how proactive they are.
Okay. So the current data is from DQ and
we've got data from Virginia Tech, so that's the round of sampling anyway. Yeah, Dr.
How easy, readily available is this made to the residents of Flint?
The results from the sampling?
Yeah, is that ever made?
Yeah, I mean each resident gets a report back on at least their lead and their copper.
Is it understandable to somebody who doesn't necessarily have a degree?
Well, I mean, if you've been paying attention to what's been going on over the last 3 years, I mean, Flint residents have learned a lot about what phrases like action level mean. I mean, who knew what an action level was before all of this? But I wouldn't want to say that every resident who gets a report back understands exactly what's printed on there. I think we still have some serious issues around communication of the risks. But a lot of residents do by now have a general understanding of what amount of lead ought to be there and what amount of lead is a problem. But it needs to be said that the data that we have over the last 6 months on lead, even though it does show a trend in the right direction, we need to be very careful about reading too much into that. We need more sampling, more monitoring of the system before we can say we're out of the clear, even when it comes to lead. Levels of lead in water always go down as the weather gets cooler. They're likely to go back up to some extent as the water warms up, so we need to pay attention to that. It really must be said that there are many, many residents in town who are very worried about what else is in the water. There are still concerns around bacteria. There are concerns over a range of other contaminants that have been detected to some degree anyway in the water here. And one of the things worth pointing out is that people have a lot of health symptoms that they're experiencing that aren't necessarily or even plausibly explained by lead. Right. So that's one of the things that leads people to think that there's something else going on with the water.
Okay, so EPA sets the federal guidelines. Who in the beginning called EPA to come help us, I guess, to come take a look at Flint? Because they were here for a few months, right?
Well, I mean, when you say EPA, you got to be careful. You've got to disaggregate that a little bit. And what I mean by that is that you've got to distinguish between the agency and some of the individuals within that agency. So we could go all the way back to early 2015, and what we would find is someone by the name of Miguel del Toro, who is a nationally recognized expert on lead in water. And he got involved in some sampling that was going on around a particular home in Flint that belonged to a resident by the name of Leanne Walters. And there were some very, very alarming levels of lead found in her water. In fact, far more lead than was necessary to qualify the water as toxic waste by EPA standards. And so Miguel was very, very involved in trying to solve her particular situation, and he was also one of the first, certainly the first at the EPA level, to raise the question of whether or not this was a manifestation of a system-wide problem.
I see. So, looking at EPA as an agency, because one argument I've been looking at a lot is through social media, and that is EPA's funding just got cut by 24% or so, and was EPA?
It could, yeah.
Yeah. So is EPA even like effective? Because one person made the argument on the internet was, if EPA was that effective, why did Flint happen? Like Flint Water Crisis, and it's just like I do not know how to wrap my head around it.
Well, the EPA is not the first line of defense against situations like this. I mean, again, yes, they established the context in which these state-level agencies are operating. They establish the context in which folks at the water utility are doing what they do. But the people who are supposed to be sounding the alarms when things go wrong are people, at the local level and at the state level. And the EPA can come in a support role when it's needed.
Is EPA requested normally?
I mean, you mean in cases of environmental contamination like this? Yeah, I mean, it's very common to turn to the EPA for help. I mean, whether it's a state agency doing it because they don't think that they have the know-how or the resources to solve the problem, or if it's residents leapfrogging over the state agencies because they don't trust the state agencies, which is often the case, and appealing to the federal agencies for help. So that was certainly something that happened in Flint. Again, Miguel was working closely with Leanne to try to figure out what was going on in her case. He authored a memo in the summer of 2015 where he raised the question of systemic lead contamination. That memo was effectively suppressed by his superiors at the EPA, who didn't think there was enough reason to get involved at that point. So there were definitely people at the EPA who acted in ways that helped to exacerbate the problem. But there were others, and Miguel was one of them, who were trying to do the right thing. Who were trying to do right.
I guess like $1 million question here is, how can we stop this from happening in the future? Because it feels like a lot of it is just part of the society not believing in the data, or like just turning a blind eye to it. Part of EPA did that, part of the government did that, and it just feels like at the end of the day the issue still exists. And how can we move further in the future and prevent things like this? Because let's say a similar thing happened to a city next to ours, and it still takes us 3 years without really like a good solution. As a social scientist, what do you think about when you think of preventing this from happening in the future?
Well, I do think about that social aspect because, again, technical problems are rarely ever technical problems. They always crop up in some sort of a social and political context. And in fact, there are many technical issues that wouldn't even rise to the level of problems if we hadn't, as a society, decided that whatever it was worth paying attention to and taking seriously. So yes, there's a technical side to the solution here, but I think you could easily make the case that that social and political reforms are even more important. We need to make sure that when decisions are made about where a community like Flint gets its water from, how that water is treated, that process is transparent, that people know what is going on, that they're given the opportunity to participate and exert some amount of influence over that decision-making process. And so that's one of the ways in which you can say that the solution to the water crisis is really an extension, must involve an extension of democracy so that people are more involved. Because I think it's pretty clear that Flint would never have switched to the river in the first place if the residents of Flint had actually been given an opportunity to have a say in that decision. That was the kind of decision that could only be made by emergency managers. And that's not to say that nobody at the local level supported the switch. You can find examples of people at the local level who supported that switch, who liked the idea that it would save the city some money, who didn't think there would be any serious problems with quality. But on the whole, I think it's safe to say Flint residents were very uncomfortable with the whole idea. So if they'd been given, a vote on the matter, it's hard to believe they would have opted to go with the Flint River.
Now, did you ever think you'd ever be this involved with this?
I did not. I was, in fact, when I first started learning more about what was going on with the water in the late summer and fall of 2015, I, of course, was paying close attention, in part because I was being personally affected by it. And I did things like tour the water treatment plant, and I was already starting to learn a little something about even the technical side of the question. But frankly, even once I learned that there were residents that were, fighting day in and day out at the grassroots level in order to make sure that Flint had clean water, and I sort of resisted getting involved, in part because I was already involved in the community in some other ways, and also very busy with my new job. It took me a while to kind of muster the courage to plunge all the way in, and it should be said that I was too late in doing so. There were people who were struggling around water going all the way back to 2014, and those are the ones who are really the heroes of the story. I was sort of a Johnny-come-lately, but once I did get involved, I very quickly got involved very heavily, very deeply, and it certainly has come to take over my life in many ways.
So what's your current activity, would you say?
Well, I would say that I'm involved in a variety of ways. I still try to go to as many grassroots meetings around water as possible and stay involved with the activists who have been struggling around water in Flint. We are also hoping that we will have the opportunity to carry out the second phase of our Legionella study. So there's a little bit of uncertainty around that project right now, but in theory we would do another round of sampling through the summer months of this year. And so, I have a variety of responsibilities associated with that role. And then again, I've been doing, because I'm spending so much time on all of this, I've got to be able to say to my institution that, there's at least some research component, because that's part of my job, and I don't have time to do any of the other research that I had been doing up to that point. So, I've been having one-on-one conversations with many of the activists who've been involved in the struggle, trying to learn more about how they got involved, what their motivations are, and what they think needs to be done, and so forth. I've been doing a lot of what we social scientists call participant observation, in the sense that I've just been, kind of immersing myself in the response to the crisis and trying to absorb as much as I can that way. And so it's been a bit overwhelming because it's such a complex situation, trying to process all of the different aspects of it and tie them together into some sort of a coherent narrative of what took place. But that's something that I'm chipping away at day by day.
Do you see yourself as an activist?
Yeah, I would say that looking back to my sort of earlier history pre-grad school, which was a very depoliticizing experience in some ways, yeah, I was an activist. I was pretty involved in the community. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, so I was involved in a number of different issues there, and really was just was starting to integrate myself pretty deeply into that scene when I decided to pack up and move to the other coast and start graduate school. And during those years, I dabbled in things here and there, but spent the bulk of my time focusing on my studies, getting my dissertation written. And so coming to Flint was a real privilege in the sense that it opened up a whole new opportunity to reinvigorate that part of my life and get involved in some meaningful activity at the ground level.
Very interesting. You want to do the weather and then coming close to the end of the show?
Yeah, of course. So just to kind of summarize what we already know about this lovely hour, it is currently 54 degrees Fahrenheit. So, excuse me, 55, it just updated. So, wow, it's got 1 more degree warmer apparently.
Right.
So, I hope everyone's enjoying the weather. At least, I don't know, I'm not a big fan, but that's fine. It's not too good to
Sounds
me.
good.
I've accepted it.
Cool. And with that, we will...
Be ending our show. I hope everyone's having a fantastic Monday. You are tuned in to WKUF LP Flint 94.3 FM. This is Society Probs with DJ White Shorts and
DJ Bro.
and our special guest, Professor Ben Pauli.
Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
I still have 2 questions for you, and we'll just answer that using our Facebook. I just got the laptop closer because it's so hard to read.
But I still talk into the mic.
No, you start drawing this. So let me just go across. All right.
Is the show archived? Can I snip a video of it?
Yes.
So we have it archived here, and then we're going to have it put on the website as well,
Oh, okay.
so that way it can be seen by everybody.
So Dr.
But we can get you a copy if that's what you're interested in.
Definitely. So you said
Where do I need to here?
just right there. So United States, there's a law that we should make water a human right, and you said it's being worked on a state level.
Well, if by being worked on you mean that there are bills that are sitting there in committee and that are, many of which are unlikely ever to get
It
out.
sounds like, I guess we're just so naive as college students. It sounds like such a nice thing to do. It looks way better. It sounds like such a nice thing to do, and why? So, is there resistance? Like water, as a first world country, United States of America, shouldn't we make it a right?
Shouldn't we make it a right? Well, yeah, I mean, in part it depends on what you mean by that, because it's one thing to say that on a moral level there is a right to water, and that seems to make a lot of sense, because after all, water is one of the things that we need as Homo sapiens to exist, much less do anything else. So on that level, there are strong reasons for saying on a moral level that people are entitled to it. But then, the whole question around whether or not we can institutionalize it is how do you take the idea that water is a human right and put it into practice? How do you operationalize it? And so there are a variety of ideas about how we do that. One of those ideas, for example, is that we should never allow anyone, for whatever reason, to be without water, without at least the bare minimum of water that they need to survive. And so regardless of whether or not people can pay for it, and this is one of the reasons why arguably water should not be treated like a commodity that is equivalent to any other commodity. I mean, water is different from an iPad. If you misplace your iPad, or if you can't afford to buy an iPad in the first place, you're not going to die. You might be unhappy, but
I see your point. Can you give an example of one basic right in the United States, basic human right, in terms of something that is provided rather than freedom of speech and freedom of that, freedom of this? I'm talking about something that is a consumer product, or something we consume, or
Well, I mean, as you rightly point out, I mean, we have a variety of rights that are written into our Constitution. We have a Bill of Rights, and certainly some of the founders who put those into place understood those to be natural or God-given rights that existed prior to any kind of society. So it was a matter of codifying rights that were already in existence from that perspective. But those aren't the only rights that we possess. And really thinking about rights began to evolve in the 20th century in particular, as we started to develop institutions that were aimed at providing people with a basic standard of living. And so, it's one thing to say that, people have the right not to have their freedom of speech infringed upon, right? That's, arguably a kind of negative right. So if you want to say something, I can't, throttle you into silence. But if we're talking about the kinds of institutions and programs that we associate with something like the welfare state, as it came to be called in the 20th century, then arguably there are some quote-unquote social rights that are bound up with that concept, that sought to provide a safety net to people that would prevent them from falling into abject poverty, that sought to ensure them a basic standard of living regardless of their ability to work, regardless of their ability to pay. And so, that's an idea that really caught on in the 20th century. It has come under attack over the last few decades in this country and elsewhere with a variety of efforts to dismantle these state institutions and programs. And in this country, it's debatable as to whether or not we ever had a true welfare state to begin with. It's easier to say that one existed in countries in places like Europe. But in this country, arguably, those social protections were meager by relative standards to begin with, and even those meager protections have come under attack. So, in that sense, there's been a debate around the very meaning of rights, right? Should we be focused on negative rights, on preventing people from having their freedom infringed upon? Or should we think of rights as a way of guaranteeing people certain things that they're entitled to, that they need to, not just to live, but to live healthy and fulfilling lives?
That answer will never probably be reached in the next 2 years, but do you think that's something that should be kept in mind with further advancements in laws and laws against things and preventing things?
Yeah, there's really a global movement around the idea that water is a human right. And so, that looks different in different countries. There are some countries that have established constitutionally that water is a human right. In fact, the latest one that I know of is Slovenia.
Slovenia?
Yeah. Just amended its constitution to say that water is indeed a human right. S-L-O-V-E, there you go. And so that is happening in countries around the world. There are a variety of countries that do recognize water as a human right. It's just that the United States is not one of them. So in thinking about how that global struggle might apply here, it may involve some sort of a constitutional amendment at the federal level, at the level of the individual states, in order to guarantee such a right to citizens.
That is interesting. I guess, as a social scientist, when we kept talking about, the social and the political movements, or social and political reasons, and that usually leads to money. And as a resident of Flint, as a social scientist with, with a good understanding of this, I guess, the whole system, how do you see Flint getting better, in terms of financial reasons? So we don't have to have emergency manager. We don't it feels like it all started with money. And
arguably one of the problems with the emergency manager law is that it empowers people who can do a lot, but one of the things they can't necessarily do is get to the root of the fiscal problems that exist in the first place, because of course the roots of those problems go back decades and decades. We'd have to talk about the whole history of Flint in order to talk about why it ended up in the economic predicament that it did. Right. So, arguably, we're treating emergency management as if it's the solution, but the question is, what is the problem? If the problem is deeper, if the problem is that a city like Flint doesn't have enough of a tax base to begin with, then it doesn't matter how much you cut back on public services. It doesn't matter how many public assets you sell off. The city is just going to keep on getting into trouble, fiscally speaking. So, there are a variety of ideas around how we make our cities more financially sustainable. One of the things that happened in Michigan was that it used to be the case that the state sort of spread the wealth around. So it would take some of the money that it received in the form of taxes, and it would effectively redistribute it to cities in need. And one of the things that has happened over the past 10 years or so, or 10, 15 years, is that state revenue sharing, as it's called, has gone down, 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 down in the case of Flint, and indeed throughout the state. So Flint lost about $55 million in state revenue sharing, which from a local perspective is a huge chunk of change. So,
on the top of your head, do you know the number of how much would it cost to fix all the pipes?
well, it depends on what you mean by all the pipes. If you literally mean all the pipes, if at the very least you mean the water mains that run down the middle of the street, as well as the service lines that run from the mains into people's houses, just to replace all that stuff. And it's worth saying we're not even talking about interior plumbing, right? So there are many homes in Flint that have had their interior plumbing damaged by the corrosivity of the water, and that hasn't even been factored into this equation. Even if we were just to replace the mains and the service lines, what we're talking about is something in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion. But nobody at this point, I mean, other than residents, is talking about replacing everything.
That's interesting, because 1.5 billion sounds like a lot, but it's really, I feel like it's not as much.
Well, I mean, in comparison to like what they have to spend money on everything else, 1.5 if that was
no, I'm
like...
talking like in terms of fee, like, can people fundraise for this? Because this
hard to fundraise $1.5 billion. You have to have an awful lot of GoFundMes to...
No, what I'm saying is that, like, if it's such a national, level crisis, then, like, a lot of celebrities step in. Because I was working at Hurley when all this was going on, and we would have, like, celebrities come in all the time. Mark Ruffalo, and all these big guys, would just stop by. And, not, like, it was like, come on, guys, help us with money. And I feel like whenever something major like this happens, there are enough millionaires and billionaires in this country that might like chip in even a little bit of money that might fix a little part of the city. Then keep going.
Doesn't mean they
Yeah, but I mean, we got to get real here. I mean, if you look at the amount of private donations that have come into the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, which is overseeing private donations, I mean, we're talking about like $7 million.
Yeah.
So, and that's with all of the national and international attention that has been paid to Flint. So, I mean, that doesn't even begin to dent the problem of infrastructure replacement. That's something that has to happen through government. I mean,
So I guess, like, okay, so we're just waiting for the government to act.
Well, I mean, what else are we going to do when it comes to, I mean, so individuals, individuals can get their, individual service lines replaced if they want to put up a few $1,000s.
That's $2,000.
But, there aren't that many people in Flint that can afford to do that.
Definitely.
And by the way, they didn't cause the problem in the first place. So,
very interesting point of view, exactly. I totally agree. And I guess, like, as an engineer, as a scientist, trying to think of these solutions, it's like, what can you do, and it's been 3 years, and it's like, government, or do we keep waiting for another 3 years, or when will the kids of Kettering University, the students of Flint high schools, will be able to, like, drink the water and say, it's safe now, like...
Well, I mean, when I say the government needs to be leading the solution here, what I certainly don't mean to suggest that it's just a matter of sitting back and waiting for people in government to act. We've already seen that doesn't work.
Exactly.
Right? So the Flint Water Crisis is a shining example of that. So, we're going to continue to need people at the grassroots level, as well as allies, outside of Flint, keeping the pressure on, continuing to draw attention to the issue, continuing to ensure that people in positions of power and authority are held accountable. It's not going to happen unless the people themselves take matters into their own hands.
Yes.
that was really profound.
Yeah. I've asked you all the questions I had in mind. Yes. Any questions for you?
I think that's it.
That would do it. An hour and 12 minutes. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for watching, guys.